Here in Blender, I have a blank shader totem scene opened, and even though I am going to be using this object as I build the shader, the most appropriate situation for this material is flat surfaces with depth. So to make sure the material fits that appropriately, on another layer I have this water cube object, which is a simple modified cube with a lot of subdivided geometry and some differing depths from right to left. And so using this object will be a good test for my material. But I'll start out with the totem. And the first thing I want to address is the geometric displacement. So we'll jump over to the node editor. I'll create a new material on our shader geo object. I'm going to call this ocean. And then we'll start our procedural texture with a texture Voronoi. And also add an input texture coordinate node. Plug in the generated into the vector. And then with our Node Wrangler add-on enabled, I'll Shift-Control-Click on the Voronoi texture to create a viewer node, and then Shift-Z in this small viewport down here to look at our shader so far, or rather our texture. And let's see, it might be helpful to have a reference image open. So I'm going to switch my outliner up here to the UV image editor, and we're going to open one of my reference images. Let's do this first one here. Yeah, here we go. This gives me a good idea of what our waves will end up looking like, or what our goal should be. And to achieve this, we're going to simply layer several Voronoi textures together. And that will involve duplicating several nodes over and over. So I'm going to go ahead and add the rest of my nodes, which is a mapping node in between the texture coordinate and the Voronoi. And we'll change the mapping method to texture. And for now, I'll leave it like that. Let's see what it's actually doing to our geometry. Let's plug this Voronoi texture into the displacement. And I'll go ahead and add a converter math node because it'll be too strong. I'll multiply it. We'll leave it at half the strength. And then Shift-Control-Click on our diffuse BSDF, which doesn't give us any displacement in the viewport. So let me check on my object data for Cycle's experimental settings so far. Until it's included in the trunk, it's in the experimental feature set. And back in object data under displacement, the method I have set to true, which if you use the shader totem scene that's included with the source files, all these settings should be available from the start. But to actually see the effect, I need to refresh this viewport render. So I'll stop with Shift-Z and then start it again with Shift-Z. And we should see some displacement, yes. Awesome, that is way too strong. Let's bump that down to 0.1. Reload the viewport. There we go, I think that's a little bit better. But the shape of the Voronoi texture by default is not conducive to the wave shape that we see in our reference. Instead, it makes our totem look like a faceted like gem or something like that. So in order to adjust this shape, I'm going to add a curve node. Color RGB curves. And now I can simply add a point in the middle, drag it towards the bottom right corner just slightly, and now this starts to create the curve shape that we're used to with waves when it goes like this. So let's see what that looks like in the viewport now. And I really don't see a difference at all, so let's try with our flat geometry instead. Let's first render it with the curve modification. Okay, yeah, we're starting to see that proper shape, but it is kind of hard to tell with the diffuse shader, and also I need to maybe increase my strength a little bit, at least to check the curve modifications that we are making. So let's switch out our diffuse BSDF for a glossy BSDF. That'll give us a better idea of the shape of our waves, as you can see here in the viewport. So let's increase the multiplier for our displacement to 0.2 and render this with the curve, and then I'll render it again without the curve modification. Here's what it looks like with the curve modification, and here's what it looks like without. So even though it is a very subtle change, you'll notice that the peaks of our waves get a little bit sharper and a little bit higher with the curve modification here. Though it is very subtle, it's just that extra touch that I think finishes off the proper ocean wave shape. So I'm going to keep that and then propagate it to my other layers of Voronoi, which I think I'm ready for at this point. So back to the node editor and unmute our RGB curves. And just before I duplicate it, I do want to make one change. If I shrink my X scale value, let's go to 0.5. What this will do is start to compress my waves to stretch a little further horizontally. Right now they're all stretched the same amount in each direction, but I think this reference shows that our waves are closer together this way, and they're actually stretched slightly in the horizontal direction. So shrinking that scale value in the X direction will give us the desired result. Let's just take a look at that in the viewport. There we go. That's more like what I'm after. Okay, so now we can duplicate these nodes to create the second layer of Voronoi texture. So select those and then Shift-Control-D to maintain the socket connections. And the difference with this one is I'm going to decrease the effect of our RGB curves slightly and just kind of adjust that curve point. And then the scale of the texture itself, I'm going to double to a value of 10. And let's refresh the viewport, see what that does for us. Oh, it shouldn't do anything because, yeah, I haven't connected it or related it at all to the first layer. So I need to do that with a color mix RGB node. Let's make a little bit more room for my displacement nodes. Move them off to the left. And this is simply going to be a mix operation of the first one with the second one. And let's see what it looks like half and half. Okay, so this is accidentally hit Shift-Control click on this mix so we see what the texture looks like in its raw form. Let's plug it up to our displacement multiplier and see what it looks like with the shader or the glossy BSDF. Now refresh the viewport. There we go. That's looking pretty nice. We're starting to get a finer level of similar waves, and that's starting to look more like our reference up there. So that's pretty cool. And just to break up our texture a little bit more, I'm going to rotate the Y value to 35 degrees. And it's maybe not going to be noticeable, but offsetting them from one another helps to break up that procedural look. So I'll want to do that with the following layers, just to keep them different from one another. And now for the third layer, again, I'll duplicate these three nodes with Shift-Control-D. And we'll increase the scale to, let's go to 40, which will make it by far the finest layer of waves. And then I'll switch around my Y rotation value. Let's just go to 200. Maybe change my X scale to, let's go to 0.3. And I'll change the scale up here to 0.4. Again, just to differentiate these layers. And then for the curve, I just want to soften these waves a bit. So make it like an S curve. Just a slight S curve. And now to mix that with our other two layers, mix RGB, and we'll actually make this an overlay operation. And we'll keep it fairly subtle with a factor of 0.2. And now plug that into our multiply node. But first I'll Shift-Control click on this overlay so we get an idea of what the raw texture information looks like. So if we zoom in close, we can see these start to layer on top of one another, and that finest layer is going to give us a lot of that high frequency breakup as it mixes in well with the other layers. So let's now see what that looks like as geometry displacement. Refresh the viewport, and yeah, that's looking pretty good. The only thing about this viewport is that it's at a subdivision layer of 3, and it'll be rendering at a level of 5. So we'll get a lot more detail in that final render. So I'll go ahead and kick that off just to make sure that it looks good. Yeah, I think that's looking pretty nice. It's certainly a higher frequency, so there's all that detail in there that I'm after. But let's see, the only thing I want to add, if we maximize our reference, well, you know, it actually looks pretty similar to this reference. But I think I'm going to add one more layer of wave texture, just so that it has one more dimension. Let's see if I can't find a reference image that showcases this. Perhaps this one will. Let's take a look. Yeah, okay, so we can see in this one that there's a lot of that generic kind of pattern throughout the entire ocean, but we do get some larger waves like right here. Let me change my grease pencil to white. Here's a larger wave, and then we've got a section right here, also here. They're just bigger waves that I think give us a better sense of the overall scale of this ocean. So in order to achieve that in our shader, let's go back to the node editor. I will duplicate these top 3 nodes, Shift-Control-D, and we'll actually decrease the scale value to 2, which means they'll be by far the largest set of waves. And I will incorporate this by adding it over top of everything else. So color mix RGB node, and we'll plug that in after our overlay, and we'll make this an addition and drag our newest layer into the second slot. And we'll change the factor down to 0.4. So if we take a look at the raw texture information, let's just see what this looks like by itself. Here you can see that the white areas are going to be the large waves that I outlined up here in our reference. Now just to refresh our viewport. Yeah, I think that's going to look pretty nice. How about I render in a new slot and then compare with the old one. Here we are after, here we are before. So it is a subtle change, but we do see certain areas start to peak up a little bit higher. And this extra layer of waves will certainly come in handy for our larger scale ocean scenes. So yeah, this is how I like to set up the waves, but hopefully you can see that it's completely customizable to be whatever you want, however many layers deep you want it to be. But I'm pretty happy with this. So let's go back to the node editor. And we know how that looks on our wide open ocean, which is the most important. But let's see what it looks like on our shader totem. Let's stop viewport rendering, turn off our water cube layer, and then enable totem. And re-enable viewport rendering over here. Because you never know, if you're making like some sort of mythological water titan or something that's made out of water, but it takes the form of a biped or some sort of wild creature that you're coming up with, we'll want to see how it looks on a non-flat surface. So let's see, it's pretty spiny over here in our viewport. Let's turn down the strength of our multiply node, 0.1. Refresh the viewport. And yeah, I think that'll look pretty good. Let's do a render real quick. Yeah, I think that looks pretty cool. Though the scale is pretty small of the surface in general, so it kind of gives the impression, that if this object were made of the ocean, then we would be way up in a helicopter, looking at small waves versus big waves. So the last thing I want to do with the displacement is add in an easy way to change the overall scale of our wave procedural texture. And we'll do that with an input value node. And then I'm going to add a math node for each of my texture layers. So converter math, change the operation to multiply. And then for the bottom socket, I'm going to make that the scale value of each of our Voronoi textures. So 2, 5, 10, and 40. That's 2. Connect the upper socket to our value node. And our value should be at a level of 1 by default. And now I can duplicate this 4 times, Shift-Control-D. And for each one, the second texture is 5. Third texture is 10. And then the fourth texture is 40. There we go. Now I can plug each of these into the appropriate scale value. And now if I want to change the overall scale of my ocean, or at least the wave element, I can simply hit 0.5 and now they'll all be bigger and will appear closer to the ocean. Or I can go up in value, let's go to 3, and now I'm even further away from the ocean and the waves are smaller. This option will come in handy when we deal with other objects of various scales in future projects. So we'll leave that at 1 since I like it there. And now to organize this, I'm going to put all of my displacement nodes, let's see, minus the multiplier actually. Okay, so all of these guys I'm going to frame together inside the, let's see, frame selected node. This way I can move the entire grouping of nodes, but that is of course different than a shader group node. With this I can add a label to it, so let's call it displacement. There we go. And now for the next lesson, we're going to look at the refraction and reflection characteristics of our shader.